If you want to see lots of great crafty crochet tutorials, make sure to click that subscribe button. Hi everyone, and welcome to the video tutorial for my Weekender tunic. We're going to be crocheting this tunic start to finish, and I'm going to show you everything you need to know to make it. I'm going to make mine in the size medium, but this pattern is offered in sizes extra small all the way up to 3XL women's. Just click the link in the description box below to see the written pattern in full and grab your sizing requirements. Now you're going to need some Lion Brand Rewind yarn. This is a brand new yarn from them that I believe is only on the website right now. I'll link that in the description box below as well. It's a category 5 weight yarn, and you can use a comparable one if you don't want to use Rewind, but I love it because it really holds up well to the sand and salt that I'm going to be using it for as a beach cover-up. Now you're also going to need a crochet hook. I'm using a size L or 8mm. But make sure to check your gauge as per the written pattern as well to make sure that you have the right sizing. Now I also want to point out that the purchased PDF of this pattern will come with a simple stitch chart as well as a stitch table, and that is going to help you a lot if you're not used to reading patterns. It's going to offer some additional help for those of you that may need a little bit of a boost with reading patterns and you need to adjust things for your sizes. It's going to list everything out nice and neat, and that's available also at the link in the description box where the blog post is, and you can purchase that really inexpensively. So going ahead and getting started here, again, I'm making the size medium. I'm going to start with this grayish color, which is my contrast color, because we're going to work from the bottom up for this tunic. Now go ahead and start with a foundation chain. I'm going to begin with a foundation chain of 82 stitches. So go ahead and work up however many chains you need for your size. It will vary depending on your size. Medium size is going to use 82 stitches. And we're working up the width here of our tunic. This is worked in 2 identical panels, so we're going to make 2 panels that look exactly the same and then sew them together. Now working row 1, we're going to count down to the 5th stitch from our hook, and we're going to double crochet. So remember, double crochet is yarn over, insert your hook, pull up a loop, yarn over, pull through 2, yarn over, pull through 2. That is our double crochet. In the 5th stitch from our hook, we're going to double crochet in the following chain stitch as well. And this is how that should be looking. 2 double crochets. Now we're going to chain 2, 1 and 2, and we're going to skip 2 stitches. 1, 2. Then double crochet in the 3rd stitch. Regular double crochet, and that is what will create these openings or kind of lacy mesh pattern, those chain 2 skip 2s. Now we're going to double crochet in the following stitch as well. So once again, working 2 consecutive double crochets, and this is how things should be looking. You should have 2 double crochets, a chain 2 skip 2 space, and then 2 more double crochets. We're going to keep repeating this all the way across. So again, chain 2 and skip 2, 1, 2, and then 2 double crochets, 1 in each stitch. No matter what size you're making, this system is going to be the same. The only difference is how many chains you start with for your foundation chain. So whether you're making an extra small or a 3XL, you're going to still stitch in the 5th stitch from your hook to begin row 1, and then do exactly as I'm doing here in this video. So don't think that because I'm making the medium here on camera, you can't follow this to make another size. You totally can. Same system. It's just a difference with that foundation chain, and then obviously you're going to have a different number of stitches per row moving forward, but hopefully this visual representation can help you a lot. So just go ahead and continue that on to the very end of your chain. We should end with 2 stitches still open. So here we have row 1 almost complete. I still have a few stitches here on the end. So you'll see that I've completed my sequence, and I've finished with my chain 2, my skip 2. I have 2 more stitches hanging out here. I'm going to work my 2 consecutive double crochets. So my last 2 chain stitches of the row are going to get a double crochet and then another double crochet in this last one here. So everything should be nice and symmetrical, and you should have the number of stitches indicated in that written pattern below. For my size medium, I should have 40 double crochets here in row 1. Now moving on to row 2, chain up 4, Again, same system no matter what size you're making, so go ahead and chain 4 no matter what size it is you're working on, and turn your work. Now what we're going to do is we're going to skip over these first 2 double crochets here, and we're going to work into that first chain space that you see, and work 2 double crochets into the chain space itself. So there's 1 double crochet and 2. And now what we've done is that chain 4 is counting as a double crochet and a chain 2 skip 2. Now we're going to continue with the sequence, chain 2 and skip 2. So skip these 2 double crochets right here. We're going to work 2 double crochets into the chain 2 space. And then we're just going to keep repeating this sequence along, just as we did in row 1. So working our 2 double crochets in each chain space with a chain 2 and skip 2 in between. And this is how it should be looking. That double crochet, the chain 4 rather, that counts as a double crochet in the beginning is going to be important moving forward. In the odd rows, so rows 1, 3, 5, and so on, your starting chain is not going to count as a stitch, but in your even rows, rows 2, 4, 6, 8, and so on, are going to count as a double crochet. That first chain 4 will count toward your stitch count. So if you're counting your stitches to make sure that everything is lining up, you should have the same number of stitches in every row of the panel until we get to the shoulder area. So for me, size medium, I'm going to have 40 stitches in each row. That is not going to change row to row, but you need to make sure that you're counting things right in order to kind of double check yourself. So here, I'll show you what I mean. At the end of row 2, I've worked all the way along, and now I have these last 2 double crochets. I've worked my last chain space, and then I have that turning chain hanging out. I've chained 2. I'm going to skip over these 2 stitches. Then I'm just going to work 1 solo double crochet into the top of that beginning chain. So the top of that turning chain from row 1 is going to get 1 double crochet. And now if you count your stitches, you'll see that you have the same number of stitches as row 1 if you count that beginning chain 4 as a stitch, and then this 1 double crochet on the end as a stitch as well. So beginning row 3, we're going to chain up 3 and turn. Remember, this time we're working an odd row, so that chain 3 will not count as a stitch. And we're going to go ahead and work 2 double crochets into the immediate chain space. So that chain space that's right there, right next to your turning chain. Now we're going to chain 2 and skip 2 and work 2 more double crochets into the chain space. By now you should be getting pretty comfortable with how things are going. Really, you're just working into chain spaces and then chaining 2 and skipping 2. And you're just going to keep working that along row after row after row. And you're going to just alternate repeating rows 2 and 3. Really all that changes between row 2 and 3, because you're working the same thing for the body of the row, is how you begin and end it, because you want to make sure that you keep straight edges, and we do that by kind of alternating the way that we begin and end these rows. So I'll show you how I finish row 3, same way I finished row 1. So you'll see here that I have those 2 double crochets, and then I have that last chain space hanging out there. Make sure you stitch into that as well. Remember, that was our chain 4 from the beginning of row 2. Counts as a chain space, so make sure you work your last 2 double crochets into that chain space there, and this is how it should be looking. All of your odd rows are going to be worked the same way, and all of your even rows are going to be worked the same way. So you'll see that now moving on to row 4, I'm going to repeat what I did in row 2 by chaining up 4 and turning, skipping over that first 2 double crochets, and working my 2 double crochets into the chain space. Same thing we did just a minute ago, and we're just going to keep alternating this moving forward. Now, you're going to work up a whole bunch of rows repeating row 2 and 3. Depending on your size, again, it's going to change the number of rows you're working on. If you want to purchase the PDF download, it will make it a little easier to look at your sizing and decide how many rows you need to make and all of that kind of stuff. But as far as just following the written pattern, it's laid out fairly simply for you. I will tell you that I am going to change color from my contrast color, that is this one, it's called Grayish, to the maroon color that you saw pictured in the beginning of the video. That one's called Current Situation in the Lion Brand Rewind yarn. I'm going to change color after about 12 rows of this stitch. So I've caught up with you here. I've worked up a bunch more rows. I just want to show you kind of how it should be looking, that my edges are remaining straight, and this is how the fabric should look. So hopefully you have something looking a little like this after about 10 rows of work. Go ahead and continue on and complete all of the rows you need for your size. For me, size medium, I need to complete 28 rows, but as I said a minute ago, I'm going to change color after row 12. So after row 12, I'm going to join my current situation yarn, and I'm going to continue on through row 28. So it's been a minute since I last saw you, and I've finished my first panel all the way through the shoulder area. Now don't freak out. I'm going to show you how to do the shoulders, but I wanted to show you real quick kind of a sneak peek at what we're going to be working on next. So you should be worked right up to this point. You shouldn't have this V-neck situation. You shouldn't have the shoulders happening yet, but you should be worked up through the body of the panel. Now, to work the shoulders, we're going to work them each separately. We're going to work one side and work back and forth and complete it. Then we're going to finish off that side, and then we're going to join our yarn again, and we're going to work back and forth across the other side. So you can see here where I joined that yarn on the second side, and then I'm going to work back and forth across on this side to complete that second shoulder. I'm not going to be working any decreased stitches per se to create this nice leaning V-neck. I'm just going to be working basically what I've been doing. It's really, really simple. You're just going to kind of skip a section, skip a chain space on each row. You'll see what I mean in just a minute, but it's really not as scary as it looks. It looks like it's got complicated shaping and all of that, but really you're just not working all of the stitches. So let's set that aside, and before you get too terrified by how complicated that looked, let's go back to where we left off. So I've worked up my 28 rows for my medium size. I've just repeated rows 2 and 3 alternating this whole time. And I've worked this up. So again, changed color after row 12. I'm working along with my current situation, and I'm going to continue on with the first shoulder. So I'm not breaking my yarn for this first shoulder. I'm just continuing on after my last row of the main part of the panel. So for the first shoulder, we're going to begin with what we are going to call row 1 of the first shoulder. Now, because this is an odd number row, and I'm moving on from row 28, which is an even number row, right? I'm just going to double check myself and count these rows right here. I'm going to be moving on to an odd number row next. So you know what that means. We're going to chain up 3, and we're going to turn our work. Now we're going to just crochet along with our odd number row as we've been doing it. Nothing is changing here. We're just going to work about halfway across. We're going to do everything we've been doing the same. That's why I feel comfortable speeding up this video just during this little section, because you're just continuing on in the method that you have been. But we're only going to work about halfway across. So for me, that means that I am going to only work into basically the first 9 chain spaces. So now at this point I've worked halfway across. Now I'm going to stop. I'm going to chain up 4 to begin an even row, my row 2 of the first shoulder, and I'm going to turn my work and work back the other way. I'm not going to continue. I'm going to forget that other side of the panel exists. So I've chained up 4. I'm going to skip that immediate 2 double crochets. I'm going to work into the first chain space that I see. Same thing we've been doing. Don't get overwhelmed by the fact that this looks different from what we've been doing, because it's not. It is not different at all. You're doing exactly the same thing here in the first shoulder that we've been doing. You're just kind of stopping short and not completing the entire row. You're stopping, you're chaining, and you're turning. Now when we get to the end of our row 2, we're going to get to that nice, clean, straight edge that we're used to and comfortable with. When we get down there, we're going to work up a chain 3, and we're going to turn, just as we have been doing. This is all so familiar and so simple, right? We're all confident and feeling good about our weekender tunic. So we're continuing on with row 3 of the first shoulder. Same thing we've been doing. Just go ahead and continue on until you get to that last chain space. And I'm going to show you here, I'm going to slow things down. So when I work into that last chain space, I have my 2 double crochets, right? So if you look at this here, we have our first row, our second row, and our third row. We've worked our last 2 double crochets. Now we should be working a chain 2, skip 2, and a double crochet into that last spot, but we're not going to do that. We're going to just forget that we're supposed to do that. We're going to go ahead and stop after that last double crochet in the last chain space. We're going to work up our chain 4. We're going to turn and we're going to work back the other way. So row 4 here, we've chained 4, and we're going to work into that first chain space. Again, this is counting as our double crochet and our chain 2, skip 2, and we're going to just complete the rest of the row. And you can see here, if I pause and kind of show you the shape, that is creating that leaning V-neck. Now you're going to just keep continuing this on. Every time that you get to your odd number rows, you're not going to finish them. You're just going to work into the last chain space available and then continue on with your next row. Now go ahead and finish off after you have worked up through row 8. The shoulder is the same no matter what size you're making. You're going to make 8 rows of this shoulder method. You're going to have a different number of stitches per row depending on your size, but the method is the same. Now moving on to the second shoulder, we're going to join our yarn. We've finished off the first shoulder, we've broken our yarn, and now we're going to make a slip knot, and we're going to join our yarn right to the next chain space available. So you can see here that we are only leaving that 2 double crochets right there in the center of our tunic, right in the center of the last row of the main panel body unworked. So we're not leaving any chain spaces to be spoken for here. We're not skipping any chain spaces in the middle. So I've joined my yarn, and I'm going to chain up 3 because remember, this is now back to row 1 of the second shoulder. So we're going to call this row 1 of the second shoulder an odd number row, just like row 1 of the first shoulder. We've chained up 3, we've turned. We're going to double crochet into the immediate chain 2 space here just once because that first double crochet is counted as the chain 3. So this should look kind of mirrored. It should look identical to the edge of your row 1 from the other side. We're going to chain 2 and skip 2. We're going to double crochet. We're going to move on exactly as we have been. Once again, just complete this odd row all the way to the end. And we should be starting to see kind of the shape that we want here. Things are going to change a bit in the second shoulder as far as how we go about creating that leaning V-neck, but really it's just because we're trying to mirror what we did on the first shoulder. It's no more complicated than the first shoulder. If you've gotten to this point, you can totally finish this thing. It's not difficult at all. I just want to let you know that you're not doing exactly the same thing because we need to mirror it. We're not doing it exactly the same direction. So moving on through row 2 of the second shoulder, we're working our even number row just as normal, keeping that straight side over there. And when we get to the middle, we're going to work into that last chain space that we can. And then here's where things get a little bit different because we are mirroring what we did on the first side. So basically all of our rows are going to be worked as if they are even number rows. So even though we're going into row 3 here, we've ended with our last 2 double crochets, we're going to stop. We're going to chain up and turn, but just with our all of our rows, even our odd rows, we're going to perform them like even rows. I know it's a slight change, but basically we're just going to start every row with our chain 4 and skipping over that first 2 double crochets and working into the first available chain space. I know it's a slight change, but basically here on the second shoulder, in order for everything to work out how we want it to and get that nice leaning V-neck and everything to look kind of symmetrical, we do need to make this slight adjustment. But here in the second shoulder, just work every row beginning with a chain 4 and then work into that first chain space available. Now just keep continuing on with this. As always, when you get to in the end of your odd rows, when you get to the middle, you're going to want to just work into the last chain space and then go ahead and chain and turn so that you're kind of leaving off those extra unworked stitches there to create that kind of leaning V-neck. Now go ahead and complete through row 8 and then we'll finish off our yarn. And we have both shoulders completed. So here I have both pieces. I've made 2 identical pieces in this way. You can see here how that second shoulder looks. It's this shoulder here on the left. That's the second one I worked. It should look something like the shoulder on the right. And I have another piece, another panel that's exactly the same. So here at this point, we just need to seam things together. We need to join all of this together into a wearable shape, and then we're just going to add the scalloped neckline detailing stitches right at the end. And then this tunic will be just about done. So we're coming to the end here. We have very few stitches left to work, so we need to just go ahead and line these up. They're really, I mean, there is a right side and wrong side to this fabric because we worked in turned rows. It's a little difficult to identify, so it's not the biggest deal if you can't identify the right and wrong side, because really the front and back looks almost the same on each of these panels. So just make sure that whichever sides you want facing out are facing toward each other. I've left the yarn on my last shoulder of my second panel, my second shoulder on my second panel. I've left the yarn joined together. I have not finished it off. Now that I have these panels together, I'm going to situate things so that I can work my joining stitches across here. So I need my yarn on the right side since I'm right-handed. So now I'm ready to go. So basically I'm just going to join these two pieces together. I'm going to work through the tops of the stitches on both panels. And you can see here how I'm doing that. I'm going to slip stitch. So insert your hook into the first available spot on the first panel, and then also through the first stitch on the second panel, yarn over, pull up a loop, and then just pull through. I'm going to go into the next stitch, the next double crochet, and the next double crochet here on the back side. Yarn over, pull up a loop, and pull through. Now I have a chain space. I'm just going to slip stitch once into the chain space itself, and then work into the next set of 2 double crochets. Again, working through both layers of fabric, both stitches. And I don't have super tight tension here. I don't want this to gather up the seam. I just want to kind of join things that are in a nice and sturdy way. If I were to just whip stitch or mattress stitch this, it's not going to have as tight a hold. And since this tunic is fairly long and wide, the kind of anchor point for all of that weight is in the shoulder. So I wanted to make sure to go ahead and slip stitch this just to give it a little extra hold and a little extra strength, being that this piece is quite a bit longer than your average top. So I've slip stitched all the way along. You can see that here. We're going to be turning this inside out, so don't worry about the little bit of bulk there in the seam. It's plenty comfortable still, and it's not too cumbersome. So here, once I've gotten to the end, I'm going to finish off my yarn. I'm going to go ahead and weave those ends, and I'm going to join my yarn on the other side to complete the same slip stitch seaming on the other shoulder. So here I'm just finishing off. I'll go ahead and weave those ends back into the seam to make sure they're really, really nice and sturdy. And then coming over here to the other shoulder, we're just going to join our yarn and do the same thing. I will flip this back over and join my yarn to the inside of the V-neck right here and work across this way, just so that everything is nice and symmetrical. So moving on to the side seams, you will see different armhole measurements in the written pattern linked below, depending on your size. So we all need different armhole sizes, and for me, size medium, I'm going to leave an 8-inch armhole. Now, standard measurements for a size medium are usually 7.5 inches. But for this tunic, since it's so oversized and kind of loose fitting, I wanted a loose fitting armhole as well. So I'm just going to go ahead and start right here on that stitch where the 8-inch mark was. I've got a long piece of spare yarn here, and I'm going to sew using a mattress stitch. And if you haven't done a mattress stitch before, there are lots of great tutorials on YouTube. I've used this technique over and over again. It's really, really simple. All you do is come from the inside of the piece between the two panels and work toward the outside. So you're basically just sewing back and forth, weaving in and out. You can also sew this with a whip stitch. That would be fine too. Any standard seaming technique really works just fine for this. It is worth noting that I'm sewing just the maroon portion. So from where my armhole measurement is down to where my color change is, I'm going to just sew that together to leave a nice open armhole here, and then a nice open hip slit down here where the grayish color is. Now if I wanted to cut an extra piece of the grayish yarn and sew up the entire side seam all the way down to the hip, you can do that. It's really up to you, but I like leaving that open just to have a little bit more flow and drape in my garment. So kind of crocheter's choice there. I'm going to stop right here at the color change and go ahead and repeat on the other side. Now moving on to our scallop detail around the neckline. This is probably the most complicated part of the whole thing. You can omit it if you want. You can leave the neckline just as it is. You could work some plain single or double crochets around the neckline. You don't have to add this scallop detail, but for me personally, it's my favorite part, and even though it's a little cumbersome, it's totally worth the effort. So it's a little complicated as far as where you're going to stitch. The actual stitches are really easy, but I'm going to show you here in this freeze frame where we're going to be stitching. So the ascending side there on the left that we work next, I'm going to go over that in just a few minutes, so don't get confused about that. Let's look at just the descending side here. So that's the first side we're going to work, working down. And we're going to be working alternating clusters of 5 double crochets and then slip stitches. So we're going to work all of the 5 double crochets in the descending side into those turning chains. So those turning chain 4s that are kind of sticking out as the stepping stones of our kind of staircase shape that's going on is where you're going to work your clusters of 5 double crochet. Then you're going to be slip stitching down in between into those even rows right in the top of the last double crochet where those dots are. So look at the fabric in front of you. If you haven't worked up the sample up until this point, don't get overwhelmed. When you have it in front of you, this will make a lot more sense. But going ahead and getting started, we're going to work our first cluster of 5 double crochet right into the turning chain from row 7. So I've joined my yarn to the shoulder seam here. I've already worked the first side just so that you could see what it should look like when we're done. And I'm so sorry this is a little out of frame. Hopefully you can get the idea from the diagram and kind of see what I'm doing here. So working our first cluster here into the turning chain from row 7. If you need to place stitch markers where you're supposed to work your clusters and your slip stitches, you can. That might make it a little easier for you to identify as you're working along. But just kind of take your time and really look at what spots you need to stitch in. If you do stitch in the wrong spot, it will wind up not being very symmetrical to the other side. So just make sure to go slow and try to do what you see me doing. So here I've worked the first cluster and the first slip stitch. Now I'm working the next cluster into what you can see is the turning chain from row 5 on the descending side. Again, this is 5 double crochets all in the same spot. And just keep going, and then when we get to our slip stitch here in a moment, we're going to slip stitch into the chain space from the row below. It should look kind of like where the acute angle of things are. It should look like that kind of the spot that comes inward, and then those chain spaces on the edges of the rows are the area where kind of things come outward, and it creates that staircase shape. And then when you get to the bottom, the last cluster, here in a moment, you're just going to work 3 double crochets instead of 5 because we need to kind of work a bit of a half scallop here since we're coming down and ready to come up the next side. So there's my last slip stitch. I just have a little bit of a tangle to undo, and then my last 3 double crochets. So you can see here I have 1 edge chain space left. I'm working into it right here. So there's 2 and 3, and then before we work up the other side, we're going to slip stitch down between those 2 double crochets right there at the base of our V-neck. So you can see in the diagram right here, bottom center, that's where we're working our slip stitch before we come up the other side. So if you need to pause and rewind, of course, as always, do that as you need to. But moving on to the ascending side, we're going to begin with another 3 double crochet cluster before we move on with our standard 5 double crochet clusters. And we're going to work that this time into the first double crochet of our row 1. So 3 double crochets into the first double crochet of row 1. Then our slip stitches are going to go into the top of the last double crochet from our even rows. So instead of working into the turning chains and then the chain spaces, we're going to be working into those edge double crochets. So whichever double crochet you see as being kind of the last one on your odd number rows, that's where we're working our double crochet clusters. And your double crochets that are on the edge of your even number rows are where our slip stitches are going to go. Now I'm going to show you how I do this here in just a moment, but really it's just a matter of looking at the work in front of you, trying to identify those double crochets. You can see this here, so that's where I'm going to work into. I'm going to work kind of right around the post of that double crochet and work my cluster of 3 double crochets. And then I'm going to slip stitch. And I'm going to work my next cluster of 5 double crochets into the edge of that odd row. And then you can see here that I'm slip stitching into the top of the even row above. Then I'm working my next cluster of 5 double crochets into the next odd number row, the last double crochet there. Once we work the descending and ascending sides, we're going to work over that shoulder seam. We're going to basically just skip over it. We're going to slip stitch into the shoulder seam itself. We're not going to work a scallop in there, and then we're going to move on and do the same exact system you've seen here for the descending and ascending sides on the other panel. So you can see here me just finishing up the last of these clusters. And here I have this shoulder seam hanging out. I'm just going to slip stitch into it. And I've already worked the first side, so at this point I can finish off and weave all of my ends. But if you have just worked the first side, just go ahead and continue on with your first scallop on the other side of your tunic with the first descending side. And if you need to, again, pause and rewind and go back to the beginning of this scallop video piece, then please do that and take your time with this neckline. I know it's a little finicky and a little bit kind of cumbersome, but it really does create a beautiful result that is really just kind of the perfect finishing touch to this garment. So once we have all of our ends woven, I'm just going to kind of knot things off here to make sure it's really secure and then weave my ends. Your tunic is done. I hope you guys really enjoyed making this tunic along with me. It's going to be perfect for all of your summer vacations, and this yarn is going to hold up really, really well to the salt and sand too. I hope you guys really enjoyed this one as much as I did. Make sure to subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. Thanks so much. I'll see you next time.